And some of my favorite ones were the ones where they were basically walking down the street and, all of a sudden they were just like, wow, I get the world now. So it really can happen to anyone. And in many ways it can happen to everyone. And I think it makes sense. I mean, we all ultimately have a pretty similar kind of brain. I mean, we all have frontal lobe, with few exceptions. We all have a frontal lobe, temporal lobe, parietal lobe, limbic system, and they all more or less operate the same way. So I think we certainly should expect that everyone has the ability to have these experiences.
Welcome to another episode of the Doctor's Podcast with Rabea Akram. This is Rabea Akram. I'm a medical doctor, entrepreneur, aspiring neurologist, and in this podcast, I interview other doctors, worldwide leading experts in health and performance enhancement. And today, I have a very, very interesting, exciting guest with me. His name is Dr. Andrew Newberg. Dr. Newberg is a worldwide leading expert in the field of neurotheology. He's a pioneer in the field. He's done over multiple decades of research in this field, has published over 10 books, and has given numerous lectures. His TED Talk on this topic is one of the most used TED Talks on YouTube. So without further ado, Dr. Newberg, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on the program.
Yeah, I'm just so excited. And before we even get started, I just want to say that I'm a really big fan of your work, like to the extent that one scientist or one researcher can be a fan of another researcher's work. So I just love your papers, the research work that you've done, the books you've written, the TED Talk, the articles. And just today itself, I was watching again the TED Talk you gave on, spirituality and neurotheology,
enlightenment,
touching those topics. I just found it so inspiring, and we're going to get to all that. But for those viewers who are not yet familiar with your work, could you please tell us a little bit about, what you do?
Sure. So, I'm a medical doctor, like yourself, and I actually have kind of an interesting background in training. Includes internal medicine, so general medicine, but where a lot of I've gotten involved in this whole field of neurotheology is from the angle of neuroimaging. And I've been involved in nuclear medicine and the field of neuroimaging, looking at a whole different array of issues that people face, concussions, Alzheimer's disease, depression, Parkinson's, and so forth. And I've been studying that over the last 2 or 3 decades, really, as you mentioned. My interest in this whole topic of neurotheology really is something that stems back to when I was a kid growing up. I was just always asking a lot of questions. And to me, one of the real burning questions was always, how do we know it's real? I was very perplexed by the fact that if we're all looking at the world out there, theoretically, we're all looking at the same world. Why are there different religions? Why are there different political systems? Why are there different moral systems? And so I felt like I really want to try to understand this and try to figure out why, how and why we have these differences of perspective on reality. So I started out by looking at the brain. I felt like, well, the brain has got to be that area that's going to be the most relevant. And so I did a lot of research, kind of going through my education, early education, trying to look at the brain and try to understand what's going on with it. But as I went through that, I came to realize that there were certain questions that science was struggling to answer about consciousness, some of these big kind of philosophical questions. And so I started, in college, I started to look at philosophy. I started to look at different religious and spiritual perspectives, theological ideas. And so all of this was kind of swirling around in my own brain as I got into medical school. And that's where I met 2 wonderful mentors, one in the neuroimaging world and the other who had also been asking a lot of similar kinds of questions, have been trying to understand the relationship between our brain and our religious and spiritual selves. And as we kind of pursued both of these lines in parallel, at one point, the light bulb went off in my head, and I said, well, wait a minute, if we're doing brain scans of people with depression or anxiety or Alzheimer's, why can't we do brain scans of people who are meditating or praying? And that was really what set off an ability to do a whole series of studies, I'm sure a number of which we'll discuss shortly, but really helped to push forward this whole idea of neurotheology by not just thinking about things theoretically, but by actually doing the research and seeing what's going on in the brain, what those relationships are, and then talking more broadly about what are the implications for all of that research. What are we saying about the brain? What are we saying about our religious and spiritual beliefs and practices and experiences? And ultimately, what are we saying about the nature of reality? So that's really, and now I currently work in what's called the Marcus Institute of Integrative Health at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia. And we look at integrative medicine approaches. So that can include things like acupuncture and diet and nutrition, and certainly mind-body practices. And of course, that's what's helped me to continue to explore this whole field of neurotheology.
Right, that's a really interesting approach, or an interesting, series of different approaches that you've taken that has ultimately led you to this incredibly, exciting new field. And we're gonna touch a lot of those topics. Just wanted to interject at this point this angle of asking those fundamental questions in life that are, I think, to some extent, sooner or later, everybody asks, like, what is subjective reality? I mean, who am I? Like, right. The fundamental basic questions of life. And I guess the answer is not the number 42. There must be more to it than that. And reading your book, your latest book, Neurotheology, it was such an incredible new insight into all the different aspects. You have the psychological aspect, what it does to us as humans when we practice in religious activity, or when we meditate or pray, spirituality. And then you have, the questions whether it's our perception or whether there is actually something greater than us out there. And this whole new field of neurotheology that you have pioneered kind of looks at all those questions like no other area of research. So it's like this broad spectrum of studies that look into all these different areas, and that's what I love about the work that you do. So please do tell me, in your opinion, or in from what you have observed in your studies, what do you think is our most current understanding in when it relates to religion, spirituality, and the brain in a broad perspective? I know that's a very jumbled up question, but I guess
that's okay. It's a bit of a jumbled. Neurotheology is a bit jumbled, as you mentioned. And in fact, let me start by just sort of defining what it is, because I think that'll help to clarify some of the points in your question. Neurotheology for me is a field of study that is a multidisciplinary field, as you mentioned, and that to me is very, very important. In its simplistic definition, it is the field of study that is looking at the relationship between the brain and our religious and spiritual, selves, or religious and spiritual phenomena, however you want to say that. But for the term to work, I think there's a couple of important points. One is that I like to say it's really a true two-way street. It is not just science looking at religion in some kind of reductionistic way. It is not religion or theology looking at the value of science, but the two of them looking at each other, and with the goal of hopefully helping us understand ourselves more, because we have that sort of, when you look at the human history, there are two major forces. There's the science and technological, which was, development of fire and development of tools and weapons and all that kind of thing, up till the present day of all the technology that we have. And then there's that social, spiritual, moral side of ourselves that is absolutely essential as well. So we're looking at those two primary forces in human history and how they interact with each other. Now, that being said, I also like to say that the neuro and the theology side of neurotheology have to also be defined very broadly. And that's part of what brings in the multidisciplinary nature of the field. So the neuro side, as you mentioned, I mean, that can include certainly neuroscience or neuroimaging, but it can include psychology, it can include anthropology, it can include sort of the larger fields of medicine, just how our immune system and our hormones and all of that kind of swirl around in our bodies that to help us to be who we are and how it helps us with all of the experiences that we have. So that's the neuro side. And then the theology side, theology in and of itself is a specific discipline that takes a given doctrine, a different story or sacred concept, and tries to figure out what it means and bring it into our lives. So we can look at theology, we can look at the ways in which we look at these questions theologically and how our brain wraps itself around those kinds of questions, the nature of free will, what is enlightenment, is there, how do we think about the concept of God? But there's many other aspects. Theology itself also needs to be broadened. So it includes practices like meditation and prayer. It includes the various experiences that people have, ranging, a whole continuum ranging from what somebody may feel walking into a church to profound mystical experiences and all the kinds of experiences in between. So if we look at it that way, then we have what I think is a very dynamic, very active kind of process that really seeks to understand all of these different kinds of intersections. And I think ultimately then we can start to say, well, so what is really going on in the brain? What are the areas of our brain that turn on when we pray, when we meditate, when we have some kind of intense spiritual experience? And of course, there's also a huge variety of those experiences. So, to have a model, if you will, that helps us to understand the differences between a mystical experience and the experience that someone may have just in, a standard meditation program or walking into a church or synagogue or mosque or something like that. So there's just this ability to look at the whole nature of these religious and spiritual phenomenon and how they affect us.
Yeah. That's incredible. You just mentioned, spiritual experiences. Different people have explained different kind of enlightenment, and where people kind of have this deeper sense of being connected or being united to something greater. There are many anecdotal, stories about people having these sort of experiences. There are also accounts in which people have outer body experiences in near-death situations. That's a whole entire area of research and study. So, do you, in your, view, is there any common thread to all these experiences? And I have come across something very interesting going through your TED Talk. You mentioned something about some core elements of, enlightenment experiences. Could you please go a little bit into detail with that?
Sure, I would be happy to enlighten you on that. The data that we have used to help us understand these experiences more comes from two main sources. One are all of the imaging studies that we've done. So we've done all these brain scan studies of people doing different practices from different traditions, and looking at what goes on in the brain and how it's related to the different experiences that they describe. And then the other big piece of data that we are deriving this information from is an online survey that we ran for about 5 or 6 years, and this was now going back about 10 years, where we asked people, it was an online survey where we asked people to provide a lot of information about themselves, about their religious and spiritual backgrounds, and most importantly, about the specific spiritual experiences that they had, one or more experiences that they may have had. And ultimately asked them to give us like a narrative of these experiences so we could analyze what people said. And what was fascinating was that on one hand, every experience was unique. I mean, there was no two experiences that were described in exactly the same way, and wonderful details that are just so incredibly distinct for each kind of person. So that in and of itself is interesting, that everybody in some sense has a different experience. But as you also mentioned, what we've been able to put together based on now these two lines of evidence, the survey as well as the scans, is that there seem to be about 5 core elements that are pretty universal. Again, the details can be very specific for any given individual, but there seem to be these 5 core elements of these intense mystical or enlightenment or awakening. Somebody once corrected me and says, we don't really use enlightenment that much anymore. We should use the term awakening. But what they are, you mentioned one of them. One of them is the sense of oneness or unity that seems to be fundamental. So a person feels deeply connected to the universe, to God, whatever it is that they feel connected to, but this very intense feeling of connectedness. And the area of the brain that we think is involved in that is the parietal lobe, so located in the back of the brain. This is an area that normally takes our sensory information and helps us to create our sense of self from a spatial perspective. So what we had proposed many, many years ago was that during these intense experiences, there is a decrease of activity in this parietal lobe region. And this is exactly what we have observed in our brain scan studies. We think that that makes sense because if this area normally turns on to help us create our sense of self and establish where our self is in relationship to other objects in the world, then a decrease of activity would be associated with a kind of loss of the sense of self and a loss of the boundaries between ourself and the world, a sense of a loss of the boundaries between objects in the world. So that sense of oneness, that sense of connectedness. And so that to us is one of the core pieces of the experience. Another core piece of the experience is a sense of clarity. For the people who describe these experiences, one of the things that they almost uniformly say is that as a result of this experience or during this experience, they felt like they derived wisdom and knowledge and some kind of clear understanding about the world, about themselves, that they never had before. It's like they now get it. They now understand what the world is like. Now, exactly where this is in the brain, we're not entirely sure. We've postulated a number of different areas of the brain that seem to get involved in these practices. And one of the ones that might be particularly involved in this sense of clarity is a very core structure called the thalamus, which is a very central structure, and it helps different parts of the brain to communicate with each other. It helps bring in a lot of our sensory information into the brain. And so in many ways, it's very responsible for our perceptions of reality. And so, and we have observed differences in the thalamus between those people who are long-term meditators and have had these kinds of experiences versus those people who have not. So, we haven't fully linked it together with this sense of clarity, but that is part of what we think might be going on. Another core element, the third one, and this is not in any particular order, is a sense of intensity. And so when we go through these descriptions, lots of words like infinite, incredible, astounding, amazing, so people talk about whatever's going on in these experiences as kind of the most of whatever it was. It might be the most powerful feeling of love that they've ever felt, the most powerful sense of oneness, the most powerful emotional response, joy or something like that, or awe. And where we think this probably happens in the brain is in the limbic system, the emotional centers of the brain, which help us to denote what things are important in our environment. So it makes some sense to us that these areas would be activated when people have these very, very intense experiences that really change, their perceptions of the world and bring this sense of clarity and oneness as well. The fourth component is a sense of surrender. And we particularly observe this in practices like Islamic practices, which are basically, Islam is about surrendering to God. But there are many practices where a person describes that sense of, I'm not making it happen. Is this something that starts to happen to me? And that sense of awakening or enlightenment, really, that is what's exactly happening. And again, a couple thousand descriptions of these experiences, almost everyone says, I was along for the ride. It was happening to me. I had no control over where I was going in this experience. And the area of the brain that we think is involved in that is our frontal lobe, so located behind the forehead. And this is an area of our brain that is involved in executive functions, in purposeful actions that we do. So if we're trying to solve a problem, if we're trying to, figure out if we're lost and we're trying to drive to where we need to go, it's the frontal lobe that turns on and helps us to concentrate. In fact, a lot of studies like meditation and prayer involve increasing our activity in the frontal lobes, which is involved in the ability to focus our attention on our breath, on an object, whatever it is that the person is focusing on. But during a sense of surrender, that frontal lobe activity goes in the opposite direction and it actually drops in activity. And again, this is what we've seen in these kinds of practices where the person feels, quote unquote, taken over or surrenders themselves or lets go to that experience. And we think, again, that that's part of that aspect of the experience where the frontal lobes actually drop down in their activity level. And then the fifth element, which isn't necessarily so much a characteristic of the experience itself, but a sort of the result of it, is the transformative nature of the experience. And so with all of these other core elements, it changes the person. And in our book, How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain, we talk about the big E and the little e experiences. So the little E's are the sort of those small aha moments that almost everybody is familiar with, and that's helpful because people kind of get it. They understand what that moment might feel like. But it's and those little moments will change the way you think about a problem, the way you solve something at work or a relationship issue or something like that. But they don't change all of you, and that's what's different about these big spiritual big E experiences, which is that they transform every aspect of the person. And again, we have the data to support that people in general feel that they have had transformations of their spirituality, their religiousness, their relationships, their sense of life, death, meaning and purpose, and so forth. So it changes everything across the board for the person. And again, that to us is really, those are the 5 fundamental core elements of these kinds of enlightenment experiences, supported by both the descriptive nature of these experiences that we've gotten from a couple thousand, regular people who are having these experiences, as well as what we see on the brain scans during these practices that helps us to understand better where these experiences reside, at least within the brain. And again, it certainly never negates the possibility of that larger consciousness, that supernatural realm. But ultimately, when it coalesces within us, these are the areas within our brain that seem to be.
Right. One thing that I found really fascinating, what you just said, is this difference between these subtle aha moments that you just named, like the small E moments, like the smaller enlightenment or awakening, if you want to put it that way, and the bigger transformative life-changing experiences that kind of shift your perspective, change your entire outlook, and changes basically everything within you. And I for myself personally, I cannot recall if I have yet had a big E moment, but I most certainly can say there have been small E moments during. I grew up in a traditional Sufi family, so I'm very familiar. Like growing up, I have heard these terms were like unity, like when you become one with the higher power. So those are concepts that I kind of grew up with. And during prayer or meditation or being in nature, I think I have had those small E moments, like where you kind of feel a deeper inner sense of peace. But if one would ask me if you have had a big E transformative experience, if I would have had one, then I would probably know it. So my question to you is there any way that I could tell, like, would you be able to do a brain scan on me and be able to say that, yes, you have had a big transformative moment? Are there objective, measurable changes that happen to a person when they have had those big transformative, life-changing enlightenment moments?
Well, it's a great question. And this is, it gets a little bit into this discussion I have with a lot of my scientific colleagues about, neurotheology and what it means and how it works. Part of what neurotheology does is it challenges science to ask very difficult questions and to try to unravel some very complex things that are going on inside of people. So the short answer to your question is that we actually don't really have a way of knowing for sure, what somebody is thinking on the inside unless you ask them. And that's why we did things like our survey and so forth, because we need to know what people are really feeling to then try to match it up with what we're seeing on the brain scans.
Right.
So, there is no test, if you will, to like, okay, here are the 10 people who all claim to have had enlightenment. Let's take a look at their frontal lobes and see, who has or who hasn't. Now, we can look at people who, who state that they have had such an experience and see if we can find differences between them and people who have not. And there's been some research trying to look at that. But there's other issues with that too, because again, one of the real challenges with these experiences is that one never knows when they are going to happen. So we almost always exclusively wind up with people after the fact. And so we don't know, if I found out that their thalamus, is asymmetric, which is one of our findings, is it that they were built that way and that's why meditation or prayer was, something important to them? Or did it change and become that way as the result of having an experience? And of course, even in the context of saying that you did or did not have an experience, if you came to me and said, yes, I did have one of those experiences, I have no way of knowing whether you actually had that experience or you're just telling me. And so, I think part of the real challenge here, and it gets back into that larger first question that I was talking about what, what's the nature of reality and how do each one of us know where we are in that kind of line of questioning. It is very challenging for any of us to even know if we've had that experience and then what that experience means and represents. And in fact, these experiences typically are very personal for people. They're very challenging for people to even understand. One of the other characteristics that is often thrown about is the notion of them being ineffable, indescribable. And that's in part because the language areas of our brain probably don't even work at the time that they're having these experiences. So, the intensities in all these different aspects make them very difficult for people to even for the people who have had them to truly understand them. So, so I think to me, this is part of what neurotheology has to look forward to in the future, which is how well can we really assess them? How do we get at them? How do we get at them from the descriptive perspective, the narrative perspective? How do we get at them from the biological perspective? Can we set up a program that tends to enable people to have these experiences and scan people before and after and watch what happens? But again, even there, how you go to a Buddhist monastery, who's deciding whether somebody is enlightened or not? And I always have envisioned, what if there's one of the students who says, I'm enlightened, and then the master says, no, you're not. And then who's right and who's wrong? And how does one know? But I think, one other way of answering the question, I think, which has been my experience, is that, again, I mean, usually these are very difficult experiences to understand. They're very personal. And so, usually when people are talking about those experiences, there's a little bit of sheepishness to them. They're a little uncertain about it. I'm usually more suspicious if somebody says, oh yeah, I had this great mystical experience. It was fantastic. And usually I worry about that a little bit. I mean, that doesn't mean they didn't have it, but usually that, I feel like they had, they may have had a very important experience for them. But these sort of true unitary experiences, I think, are just very difficult for people to understand, and hence they're difficult for us to get a hold of. But, in the field of medicine, there are so many things like that are subjective: pain, depression. I have no way of knowing whether you are in any pain at all unless you tell me. And even if I get a brain scan that shows activation of pain pathways, I don't know if that means you have a 2 out of 10 pain or a 10 out of 10 pain. And so, we always have to rely to a large extent on the self-report of these experiences. And that's good, but it also becomes a challenge for us.
Absolutely. This brings me to my next question. You just mentioned you saw differences in the thalamus between people who have had these kind of experiences as compared to people who haven't. Am I correct in putting it that way?
Yes. I mean, well, I guess even more specifically, it's those people who have there have been several studies, including our own, which have looked at long-term meditators versus non-meditators, which is a little different than those people who have actually achieved some kind of enlightenment experience versus those who have not. But I think for all intents and purposes, it's a reasonable thing to draw together a little bit.
Right. So When we look at these findings, can we say that people with a certain type of anatomical structure have more propensity towards getting these kinds of experiences? Like, are some people more hardwired to have spiritual experiences or be more religious? Are there genetic hardwiring? So is there any biological factors that set aside the religious, the spiritual from the atheists, people, agnostic people who don't believe in spirituality?
Sure. So, again, this is another big question for neurotheology, and we have partial answers at the moment. On one hand, I think it seems to me to be, fairly clear that people do have different propensities. I've had some people, after I give a talk and come up and they say, I've done 10 different meditation practices and each one's better than the next. And I have all these great experiences and, I'm a deeply spiritual person. And there's other people who really do struggle and they've tried 10 different meditations and they don't get it. And so I think there's definitely a continuum upon which human beings lie, as with almost any characteristic, optimism, depression, and so forth, intelligence. There's a lot of I don't know if it's a bell curve, but certainly there's some distribution of people along the lines of who is able to have these experiences more easily than others. Now, that being said, it's also important for people to realize that these experiences appear to be able to occur in virtually everyone. I mean, if you look at our data, and that was one of the things that to me was a huge take-home point in our data of about 2,000 respondents, that you don't have to be this monk or nun sitting in a monastery meditating and praying for the rest of your life to try to achieve enlightenment. A lot of these experiences did happen under while people were in some kind of spiritual retreat or spiritual program or state. Some people had them, as you had mentioned earlier on, as part of like a near-death experience. Others had them under the influence of different psychedelic compounds. And some of my favorite ones were the ones where they were basically walking down the street and, all of a sudden they were just like, wow, I get the world now. So it really can happen to anyone. And in many ways it can happen to everyone. And I think it makes sense. I mean, we all ultimately have a pretty similar kind of brain. I mean, we all have frontal lobe, with few exceptions. We all have a frontal lobe, temporal lobe, parietal lobe, limbic system, and they all more or less operate the same way. So I think we certainly should expect that everyone has the ability to have these experiences. But now, getting a little bit more into the weeds of your question, I think that there probably are some differences that may be involved in this process. So for example, there's one line of evidence which has been somewhat interesting, which has to do with how the brain handles certain neurotransmitters. There was a book published about 10, 15 years ago called The God Gene that was done by a behavioral geneticist at the National Institutes of Health here in the United States that suggested that a specific gene seemed to have a correlation with people who had feelings of self-transcendence. And interestingly, the gene which coded for a receptor in the brain called the VMAT2 receptor is a receptor that actually handles serotonin and dopamine levels in the brain. So, there was that. We did a brain scan study of people going through a spiritual retreat program that showed that those kinds of retreats actually make the brain more sensitive to the effects of dopamine and serotonin. And there's also another interesting line of evidence, patients with Parkinson's disease who have lost their dopamine levels as part of the disease process. There's a subset of them, depending on which side of the brain is involved, that become less religious or less spiritual. So I think that there's something about the level of dopamine or how the brain handles dopamine that is probably at least one part of what gives us a predisposition to having these kinds of experiences. Now, people have explored other aspects about how and why people are religious or spiritual. So for example, some have looked at the ability of people to see patterns in different things. And so this may have something to do with our parietal lobe or our frontal lobe that looks and concentrates on things. And some people are what they would do studies of religious individuals and non-religious individuals, and they would show them, they would take a picture and make it very blurry and say, what do you see in the picture? And religious people would see more things in the picture, than the non-religious people would see. Sometimes they saw things that weren't really in the picture, though, the religious individuals. On the other hand, sometimes the non-religious people didn't see things that were in the picture. So in some sense, everybody sort of makes mistakes, if you will, depending on sort of how their brain looks at things. But some people make them in one direction and other people make them in another direction. And again, that may have something to do with the predisposition of people to have these experiences. But the last thing I'll say about that, though, is that while we may all have these different predispositions, and as I mentioned, our data suggests that almost anybody can have these kinds of experiences, I think also very importantly is that if one actively engages in a process designed to try to find those experiences, meditation, for example, if everyone on the planet meditated for 6 hours a day, we would probably all get pretty spiritual. Now there still may be the Dalai Lamas of the world, compared to the rest of us. But, I think if we all practice those certain abilities, that we have an opportunity to be able to advance ourselves along those lines. And whether, there's never a guarantee that any of us will achieve, some type of intense spiritual experience or enlightenment. But the more we go down those paths, I think often, what the data also suggests is that people become more open, more compassionate, more loving, more forgiving. And so there's a lot of potential benefits, even if one doesn't have those intense spiritual experiences.
Right. So another aspect in your book was psychological effects and the benefits, and also sometimes in some cases adverse effects that religious practices or spiritual experiences can have for people. Can we touch that topic a little bit? What does it mean for the psychological well-being, mental health for people when people engage in meditation, or it be spiritual practices, religion, whatever that is in the context relevant for the person?
Yeah, well, this is now, heading into a direction that I sometimes refer to as applied neurotheology. What are sort of the practical applications? And one of the things I love about neurotheology is it ranges from the very practical to the very esoteric. But in terms of the practical piece, yes, there's a huge body of literature that has looked at the relationship between spirituality or religion and health, both physical as well as mental health. In general, there are positive correlations that the more religious people are, the more spiritual they are, the better they do. They have lower mortality rates. They have lower rates of different diseases, and they tend to cope better with different issues that they face. If they develop cancer or other problems, people turn to their religious and spiritual beliefs as a way of helping them cope with things. People have turned to religion and spirituality to help with addictions like alcoholism and drugs. And actually a colleague of mine at Columbia University has found religion and spirituality to be very protective of even adolescents, in terms of helping them to avoid drugs and crime and so forth. There definitely seems to be a positive correlation. And in our survey, for example, people who had these very intense spiritual experiences, again, 75–80% of them reported that their physical and their mental health was actually improved by these experiences. So, clearly there's a very positive kind of an effect, and people are doing more and more research now to explore the ability to integrate various religious and spiritual concepts into therapeutic approaches. So combining things like cognitive behavioral therapy with different religious elements, or combining mindfulness meditation with various psychotherapeutic interventions. These are all a variety of different approaches that people can take. Now, we have to be a little cautious here, because I've had a few good friends of mine be critical of us in this endeavor to say, well, religion isn't an intervention. You don't become religious in order to be less depressed or to avoid cancer. And of course, we never meant to imply that. But, and in fact, I think, that to me, as a physician, the kind of statement that can be made is that if you are someone who has a strong religious or spiritual part to yourself, then, that can be a very helpful dimension of yourself to turn to help with your overall health and well-being. On the other hand, again, context is very, very important. So you wouldn't tell someone who considers themselves to be very atheistic, hey, there's a study that showed that doing the rosary is, it reduces your anxiety. What you should do that. That's only going to increase their anxiety because they don't believe in the rosary and they don't know how to do it, and it's not going to work for them. So, and in fact, some of our research has actually shown that it's really fundamentally important that people, for lack of a better phrase, buy into whatever it is that they're doing for it to have the effect. So if you're just sitting in a church or sitting in a mosque and you're just kind of going through the motions, it'll help a little bit, but it's not going to do very much for you. Whereas if you're fully engaged in it, if it's something that really has profound meaning to you, then it's far more likely to change your brain and also to change your psychological state.
There has been a large body of data that suggests that engaging in some sort of meditation practice or a spiritual practice can have potential health benefits. So you looking at both the biological, the brain aspects of these sort of practices, and also looking at the outcomes and the subjective experiences that people have while going through these experiences. What is your what would you advise people? What is the best way if I am not a particularly spiritual, religious, or meditative person, if I want to somehow implement those ideas and improve my mental health or overall well-being? What's the best way to go?
Well, again, not to be evasive, but one of the things that is a shame at the moment is that we don't have a definitive way of answering that question. And we don't have the data. Like in medicine, if you have an ear infection, I know what kind of antibiotic to give you, and that's different maybe than if you have a skin infection, because we know that there's different organisms and we know what to do. We don't have that information to be able to say, okay, you're a 20-year-old college student who's stressed about exams, you should do this meditation. You're a 55-year-old who's divorced, you need to do this kind of prayer. So part of the problem is that we don't have definitive answers yet. But that being said, the advice that I usually give to people, again, this is in the applied neurotheology realm, is to say, well, part of what you have to do is take some stock in yourself. I mean, what is your goal? Is your goal just to reduce stress? Is your goal to improve your psychological well-being? Is your goal to achieve some kind of spiritual experience or spiritual well-being or even enlightenment? So part of what each person needs to try to figure out is what exactly is their goal. And then also important to kind of take a little bit of stock in who you are as a person. Do you come from a particular religious or spiritual background that's important to you? Or do you come from a background that you don't want to go back to? So these are important questions for everyone to address. There's a certain ease in turning to traditions that you come from because you know them, they're familiar, they probably resonate with you better. But that doesn't mean that in our survey, I would say about 70% of people were still in the tradition that they grew up in, but 30% were not. So I mean, the majority of people still stay within the traditions that they're from, and it makes sense. I mean, those were those concepts were written into your neural connections back when you were a child, so they're hard to break out of. But they also have value, and they can be used in positive ways as well for people. Then after sort of taking some stock in yourself, then we have the internet. So you go out and you look at different approaches, put in those goals and seek out different approaches. There are certainly some that are very popular these days, things like mindfulness and mindful. So you might look at some of the more popular ones because obviously they're good for a lot of people, and see if it's consistent with your goals and where you plan to go with it. And if not, then keep looking. But then ultimately, one has to kind of decide on what one wants to do and find that ritual, that practice, whatever it is, that set of practices that you are now going to try to put together as your program of your spiritual pursuits, and then to try it for a period of time and give it a legitimate try, several months or so, to see where you get with it, and are you comfortable with it? Is it taking you in directions that you feel good about? And then to continue to pursue it. It's also really helpful to talk to other people, especially people who would be your potential teachers. And again, are they are they going to sort of push you in directions that you think will be beneficial and are consistent with where you would like to go? Or are they taking you in directions that are really problematic or challenging for you? And again, it's always a balance, because sometimes you need to be challenged. So, there's certainly, some degree, but you shouldn't be distressed, and you shouldn't, it should be something that hopefully will take you in positive directions. But that to me is kind of the best advice I think people can start with right now, which is to, it's a bit of trial and error, but with a lot of, education and exploration, hopefully, the trial and error piece can be more trial than error. And but it is important for each person to really think about what their goals are and where they're trying to head in terms of their own self and their own well-being, to figure out what kinds of practices might be the best approach for them.
Listening to your TED Talk, I came across this little story of you having this intense, life-changing experience that you described as infinite doubt, if I remember it correctly. So would you like telling us a little bit about that experience?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, I mean, as I was growing up, I was really trying to understand this fundamental question of the nature of reality and how we can know that reality. And while I looked at the scientific and started to explore the philosophical and the religious and spiritual approaches, I kind of kept feeling that I wasn't really getting where I wanted to go. It goes back to my point a moment ago about, what are your goals? And so my goal was really a very deeply kind of philosophical goal. And what I decided to do was kind of take matters into my own hand and say, well, let me see what I can figure out. And I took an approach that I guess I later discovered was somewhat similar to the approach of Descartes, which I was very happy about, that I had stumbled upon an approach that seemed that at least somebody else had thought of as well, and that basically the idea was that I really felt like there were so many assumptions that I was making that everybody made about things that I needed to get beyond that. And so I felt that anything that I wasn't really sure about, I would place into what I would refer to as this realm of doubt, for lack of a better term. It didn't mean it was wrong. It didn't mean it was right. It just meant that I didn't know.
Right.
And as I went through this process, and as I said, in the first bit about science and the philosophical, so many things, I felt like, well, how do we know if the way we view the world through science is accurate? How do we know if our ideas about spirituality are right or wrong? Everything kind of kept falling into this realm, and concepts related to thought and emotions and logic and so forth. So as time went on, this realm of doubt got bigger and bigger, and the experience that I had actually took place in between my college and medical school. I had this little block of a couple of months in the summer, and I thought, I've really got to figure this out. It was giving me a great deal of angst. And I thought, before I start into my medical career, I need to know the answer to this. And so I spent a great deal of time in very deep contemplation, and ultimately had, as you mentioned, this experience that for lack of a better term, I've referred to as infinite doubt. It was that everything was in this realm of doubt. Even the doubt was doubted, if that makes any sense to people. And so it was this sort of infinite regress of doubt that had some very interesting characteristics to it, because first of all, everything was part of this doubt. So there was this sort of oneness or unity of things. It was incredibly intense, because it was just like, wow, this is everything that I can think of is in this realm of doubt. And when I've described this to some of my friends and colleagues, they say, well, gee, how come that wasn't one of the worst experiences imaginable? Here you are trying to find an answer, and you come to this idea that you'll never know an answer, that everything is just infinitely doubtful. And I said, well, what was fascinating about the experience was that it was actually one of the most peaceful and most calming and really kind of transformative experiences that I ever had. And because it sort of took the angst away, knowing that there wasn't a way to get to it. Since that time, and this is maybe 30 or 40 years ago, I can go back to that experience, and I have continued to explore what that experience means and where one can go from that kind of an experience. but it also propelled me to want to know more about other types of spiritual experiences that people had, because I was curious to know whether what I had experienced was similar or different from them. Was it that sense of oneness? Did other people have that? And this sense of doubt. I mean, was that something? So the doubt piece seems to be a little bit more something that I don't seem to hear a lot about in other descriptions. But again, certainly the sense of intensity and unity. There was certainly a sense of surrender, because there's no way I could ever come to an answer here. So, some of those core elements that we talked about earlier seem to fit some aspects of the experience that I had. But for me, again, it's really been a lifelong pursuit that to me is still the scientific as well as the spiritual, that it tries to help me to engage what this experience was, what we can, what I think we can do with this experience, and maybe still, hopefully, it brings us a little closer to answering that question about the nature of reality. And as I always like to jokingly tell everyone, if I ever figure it out, I will certainly let everyone know. But for the moment, I'm still working on it. But that was my experience, and I struggled to really understand what it was, what it means, and over the last 30 some odd years or whatever, I keep going back to that experience, and also go back to what I can gain from it, what I can learn from it, and I feel like there are many things that I have kind of learned in terms of a sense of openness, a sense of compassion and understanding of other people's beliefs, an understanding of why there are so many different beliefs that people have. In fact, to me, if there's 7.5 billion people in the world, there's 7.5 billion religions, there's 7.5 billion political systems. All of us are unique, but we also share certain commonalities as well. And the question is, how do we kind of look at both of those in ways that kind of advance us as human beings to a more, to a greater enlightenment, not only for each one of us individually, but for us as humanity.
Right, love that. So do you think as we learn bit by bit more about, what goes on within the brain and the functional structural correlates of all these subjective experiences, do you think in the future technology and will play a role in helping people augment or support people have more spiritual experiences? Do you see a shift coming through technology and science?
Well, I think it will continue to advance. I mean, the one thing when I get this kind of a question, I always remind everybody that it's been going on for thousands of years. I mean, shamanic cultures throughout the world have used different psychedelic-oriented substances to engage the spiritual world. People, Buddha engaged meditation as the device, so to speak, to achieve enlightenment, and people, through rituals and different, approaches. So there has been a lot of developments over the thousands of years of human religious and spiritual pursuits that have helped people to try to achieve those states. I think we're probably, maybe we're getting more specific, or maybe, I don't know if better is quite the right word, but hopefully we'll get better at it as well. But, there's been a lot of interest in looking at psychedelic compounds, for example, as a way to take a pill to help people to have an experience so much easier than having to go through 20 or 30 years of meditation. Now, we can get in then to the ethical and even the kind of theological debates as to, well, is that experience as good as, or better or worse or whatever? We tend to have certain biases because of our perspective on, oh, well, you're taking a drug and that's not a good thing. And maybe it isn't, but in our research, again, in our survey, the people who had intense spiritual experiences under the influence of psychedelic compounds are described in every bit the same kind of intense, they have all the same characteristics, or many of the same characteristics as those people who have them in a more quote unquote natural way. So, and there's other ways of trying to stimulate the brain through processes like transcranial magnetic stimulation, and other, externally stimulating processes. So, we'll have to see, what and how these different approaches may help us. I think context is always helpful. Going back to the psychedelics, it's going to a rave party and taking some psilocybin or something like that. I mean, it might give you a pretty crazy trip, but it's probably not going to be as spiritual as if you have been thinking about these questions, if you've been meditating, if you have been, incorporating that into the context of how you're trying to think about things. So I think that becomes very, very important. And the last thing I want to say about this, because I always want to emphasize that while neurotheology is combining the science and religion, it doesn't reduce religion to science. And so, again, we have this sort of bias that if you take a drug and have a spiritual experience, it's an artificial experience. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's the case. And for shamanic cultures, as I mentioned, throughout the world, those mushrooms and compounds like ayahuasca and so forth, they were doorways into a spiritual realm. They brought the brain into a different way of thinking about the world, but not an artificial way. In fact, in many ways, a more real way. And so, and the example that I give on a much more commonplace level is that, I wear glasses. And so when I wake up in the morning, it's a very blurry world. And I put my glasses on and suddenly the world's clear. So the world didn't change and my brain didn't change, but, I see the world differently. And so, is it possible that taking a psychedelic or stimulating the parietal lobe, just gets the brain into a different state? That's like putting glasses on the brain and seeing reality, whether it's infinite doubt or infinite consciousness or whatever, in a way that we just have never been able to do it before. So, there's so much for us to still learn, and there's so many. We have to be very careful about the conclusions that we draw and the biases that we all hold, so that we kind of take this whole field of neurotheology in directions that are beneficial, both from the scientific side as well as from the spiritual side.
Right, love that analogy, Dr. Newberg. So when people wanna find about the work that you do, where can they find you?
Well, the best place, I'd love to say I'm sad to say I'm not as internet savvy as I could be perhaps, but my website is the best source for the moment, and it's just Andrew Newberg, NEWBERG.com. People can find the research studies that we've talked about, the studies on the brain imaging and on our surveys. Every time I have a new book or new ideas, I post them up there, and you can also get to things like the TED Talk and so forth through the website. So that's the best way, and always happy to hear from people and hear about their experiences, and hopefully we're all in this process together. So hopefully we'll all learn from each other and figure out the ways of better understanding ourselves as we go forward.
Love that. We'll put all the links in the descriptions. Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure having this conversation with you.
Thank you.